Secondly, we agreed to a strengthening of our strategic cooperation with respect to energy. The European Union wants to import more liquefied natural gas, LNG, from the United States, and they're going to be a very, very big buyer. We're going to make it much easier for them, but they're going to be a massive buyer of LNG, so they'll be able to diversify their energy supply, which they want very much to do, and we have plenty of it. We decided to set up immediately an executive working group of very intelligent people on both sides. They'll be our closest advisors, and they're going to carry out this joint agenda. In addition, it will identify short-term measures to facilitate commercial exchanges and assess existing tariff measures and what we can do about that to the betterment of both.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, when I was invited by the President to the White House, I had one intention. I had the intention to make a deal today, and we made a deal today. We have identified a number of areas on which to work together. Work towards zero tariffs on industrial goods. That was my main intention, to propose to come down to zero tariffs on industrial goods. We've decided to strengthen our cooperation on energy. The EU will build more terminals to import liquefied natural gas from the US. This is also a message for others. We agreed to establish a dialogue on standards. As far as agriculture is concerned, the European Union can import more soybeans from the US, and it will be done. And we also agreed to work together on the reform of the WTA. This, of course, is on the understanding that as long as we are negotiating, unless one party would stop the negotiations, we will hold off further tariffs, and we reassess existing tariffs on steel and aluminium. This was a good, constructive meeting. Thank you, Donald.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Claude.
Emissions must have a price that changes our behavior. To complete this work and to ensure our companies can compete on a level playing field, I will introduce a carbon border tax to avoid carbon leakage.
We are committed not only to energy independence, but to American energy dominance. And the path to that future starts right here in shale country with all of you, the proud patriots of Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia. Astonishing increase in production made possible by shale and the shale revolution. My administration has more than doubled approvals for LNG exports, and it's going much, much higher than that in the pipeline. I look forward to seeing even more brand new LNG facilities. We are streamlining the EPA's oil and gas methane rule. Nobody does it better than the hardworking men and women of Marcellus Shale country. Wouldn't it be great if New York realized what they're sitting on top of? Before the competing states take a lot of it. You know, it gets down a little bit, right? Keeps going down. They'll say, hey, we used to have a lot of energy before they took them from Pennsylvania and Ohio. But New York should do it, and New York should allow pipelines to go through so the people of New England can cut their energy costs in half, so the people in New York could cut their energy costs in half. New York doesn't allow pipelines to go through. I don't know, there has to be some kind of a federal something that we can do there. But they won't allow pipelines to go through New York this for a long time. And they won't do any fracking in New York. And they won't take all of that wealth underneath and reduce their taxes. Wouldn't that be nice? They don't do it in New York. Somebody someday will explain why. They do it in Pennsylvania. They do it in Ohio. They do it in states right around New York. They don't do it in New York. They're sitting on a gold mine of energy.
You're not coming up with any solutions. You're talking about sideshows here. What we want to do is implement this plan.
There is one thing I just want to clarify. Has the government actually found out from the company that wants to do this terminal in the Shannon Estuary whether it will be using fracked gas or not? Because there is some confusion about that.
My understanding from what Minister Bruton has said, he is not going to grant any application here of granting until a review. So I don't know the answer to that.
2/3 of the increase in production of all natural gas over the past decade globally has been shale gas development in the United States. Natural gas production in the United States is now dominated by shale gas, and if Ireland were to import LNG from the United States, it would largely be shale gas.
And I'm here to tell you that the gas you'll be getting is harming people here and killing them.
For TD, Breed Smith, Fine Gael's Hildegard Nocton, John Fitzgerald, the Climate Advisory Council, and all the experts say gas is the least worst of the fossil fuels.
Well, fracked gas isn't another matter. Fracked gas is the matter because this project, the liquefied natural gas project to be floated on gas hubs in the Shannon Estuary, is actually listed on the projects of common interest by the company who've made the application, New Fortress Energy. And we have it from the horse's mouth, from New Fortress Energy themselves. They only export fracked gas. They don't deal in other gas. And Mark Ruffalo and Professor Howarth from New York University, is one of the leading scientists on gas as a transitional fuel in the country, the professor gave evidence to the committee that Hilda chairs to say that fracked gas is the most dangerous type of fossil fuel. Number one, because the methane leakage is 87 times more powerful at trapping the Earth's energy and heat than CO2 is. Reverse that and you remove methane from the atmosphere and it has the reverse effect. This is fracked gas, make no mistake about it. And by the way, you quoted Professor John Fitzgerald and the Climate Advisory Council. He's not a scientist. 10 members of the Climate Advisory Councils are not scientists. They're economists. They're people with, a professional and an academic.
The Climate Change Advisory Council? That's a very serious accusation here.
I'm telling you the truth. They are not scientists, they're economists.
Well, in fairness, you're not a scientist or an economist.
But I accept the science. I accept the science and I listen to scientists. I'm saying that we have to get off all fossil fuels. We have to get off all fossil fuels. This business about Hilda, I didn't interrupt you. About lights being on and the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine is just unacceptable. We have 15 more years of Corrib. That brings us up to 2035. We have 2 connectors at Moffat. We have guarantees, even under Brexit, from both the Energy Commission in Britain and our own Bord Gáis, that there'll be no interruption from the connectors at Moffat.
Okay. You're not coming up with any solutions. You're talking about sideshows here.
The issue of security supply is not just an Irish issue. And how do you deal with that security? Previously, we doubled the pipeline, but this particular issue with Corrib, while Corrib is still there for the next decade, and we have an alternative supply. We mightn't have it for heating, but we would have it for essential electricity if it was cut off. After Corrib, what do we do? You could have LNG terminal in somewhere where you bring in LNG, or if you found gas, it would be of value to us in terms of security supply. So it seemed to us that in terms of oil, the right answer, you can see no benefit to, little benefit to Ireland of drilling for oil. In terms of gas, there is a potential security of supply benefit. In terms of this issue, of course, whatever we do will make no difference to Ireland's emissions, which is our primary remit. So I have a concern that if one spent too much time on this issue, which really is not going to affect our emissions, it's a distraction from us making the real efforts we need to do. We're really far behind. We have to make big efforts. And devoting a lot of time to this issue, which will make no difference to our emissions, we've answered the question, and I've given you the evidence that on which our decision was based.
Complicated question. Obviously, the territorial responsibility under the existing UNFCCC processes and the Paris Agreement, it is territorial. So nations are responsible for emissions within their own territory. The upstream emissions I've talked about arising from our use of fracked gas would be in the territory of the United States primarily. Under the current arrangements, that then means we delegate responsibility for that to the US. But if they withdraw from the agreement, all bets are off, and we definitely have to look at our own responsibility much more closely.
And there needs to be strong green red lines. That's what I think.
Thanks.
Now, Sweden have pulled out their LNG project from this list of PCIs, and I'm appealing to you, Taoiseach, to listen to the scientists and do not proceed with the fracked gas terminals that will go into Shannon if we sign off on this list.
The Minister says the PCI is in our common interest. I believe it is not. It does provide advanced planning for any project. The Minister says it has planning already, but its planning is far from certain, and this would put it through a planning process that I believe would not be appropriate and right. The Minister says he's not going to support financing for it, but we don't know what the American government may do or what other actors may do to pursue this project. This is not in our interest. We found out only last week from questions asked by Kieran Cuff to the European Commission officials that it could be stopped tomorrow. I'm asking that you do that. That's in our common interest, not proceeding with it. This is a climate change issue of the first order. This government, if it wants to show its climate leadership, should stop this project now.
Taoiseach. Thanks, Deputies. This is a private sector project, not a government project, but the advice that we have is that it could be useful for Ireland when it comes to future energy security, recognising that we'll continue to use natural gas for the decades ahead. We're reliant at the moment on imported gas from the pipeline with the UK and gas from Carb. Carb is going to run out quite soon. That leaves us with only the pipeline from the UK as our only source of gas. If that were ever cut off, we'd be in serious trouble almost immediately. We would be facing brownouts and blackouts, quite frankly. And a terminal on the other side of the country gives us potential alternative way to get gas in, and it doesn't just have to be fracked gas. It could be sea gas from North
There are others.
Have you any idea how long we have left in Corrib?
I suppose the figures are updated on an annual basis. Our view at the moment is that it's somewhere probably between 12 and 15 years. 12 to
15. Thank you very much.
As a side to that, our interconnectors with the UK, we have two interconnectors with the UK that operate in parallel. Those interconnectors have little or no capacity constraint. There is sufficient capacity on them to deliver 100% of Ireland's electricity requirements, if that were the case. In terms of security of supply and the interconnectors, as I mentioned, the interconnections we have with the UK are extremely robust. They've been there since 1993. We haven't had a single outage on those. And the fact that we completed a twinning of the last section of pipeline in Scotland last year gives two completely independent interconnectors with Scotland and gives us puts us in a very robust position in terms of security of supply.
Why is there such a keen interest to get on this PCI list? And there are mainly three reasons for that. The first is that our regulation, the 10E regulation, foresees that a PCI has to undergo an accelerated permit granting procedure, and it is said that the whole permit granting, all permits, by the way, should go through a one-stop shop have to be delivered within 3.5 years.
We examined what a major supply interruption from Russia would have on Europe. We found that Ireland could sustain an interruption period of up to 10 months without the need for LNG infrastructure in Ireland. LNG imports of frack gas from the US met approximately 1% of full UK gas demand to date. Natural gas is used for electricity generation and heating in Ireland, meeting 1/3 of our energy needs. Analysis with colleagues in Europe found that the addition of the Celtic electricity interconnector from Ireland to France will further reduce Ireland's needs for natural gas, cutting the need or the volume of natural gas by about 7% when it is introduced. In essence, I guess the question is, do we need LNG? From the detailed modelling that we've undertaken in UCC, it's not entirely obvious that LNG infrastructure will be required in Ireland. We have modelled detailed supply interruptions coming from Russia, independently coming from Norway, independently coming from North Africa, and essentially the lights have stayed on in all our simulations in Ireland. That points to the fact that maybe LNG infrastructure is not required within Ireland. The things that make the Irish gas system relatively secure and resilient, and it's worth bearing in mind that actually we have never had a supply interruption of gas coming into Ireland. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've had 2 supply interruptions on the electricity interconnectors, both Moyle and the East-West. So we're incredibly lucky to have a resilient gas infrastructure, and the recent twinning of the gas pipes coming from Scotland into Ireland increases that resilience even further.
And I'm just wondering if you, in your vision for 2050, have you taken account of the PCI listed project for frack gas in Shannon? Have you thought about that? Have you factored it into your graph here for how the future might look in 2050, etc.?
No, we haven't, because until such time as we know that there is an LNG terminal going to be built, we haven't factored it in. What we have factored in is our existing sources of gas plus the renewable gas and hydrogen that we refer to in the Vision 2050.
Okay.
It is a matter for policymakers and regulators to decide what gas is appropriate, what gas is not appropriate, and therefore we don't get involved in either supporting or not any particular source of gas. The leakage of methane in gas production in Europe, and this is from the European Environmental Agency, is 0.6% well to wheel or well to ins use. And our own network is because it's a relatively new network in terms of a European context, the figure is about 0.1%.
2/3 of the increase in production of all natural gas over the past decade globally has been shale gas development in the United States. Natural gas production in the United States is now dominated by shale gas, and if Ireland were to import LNG from the United States, it would largely be shale gas. Methane is the major component of natural gas, including shale gas, and methane is an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas, more than 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And it's important to note that the Earth's climate system responds much more quickly to methane than to carbon dioxide. And so reducing emissions of methane is critical to reaching the United Nations COP21 target of keeping the planet well below 2 degrees compared to the pre-industrial baseline. We simply cannot do that with CO2 emissions alone. And if we do not reduce methane emissions, the Earth will shoot through the 2-degree mark within the next 20 to 30 years with devastating consequences. Unfortunately, society has not so far acted to reduce methane emissions, and rather methane in the atmosphere is rising rapidly over the past decade. My latest research, published in the journal Biogeosciences this summer, demonstrates that shale gas development in North America is the single largest driver of this increase in global methane. Shale gas in the United States accounts for 1/3 of the increase in all global emissions from all sources. In the United States, approximately 3.5% of the shale gas that's developed is emitted to the atmosphere as unburned methane due to leaks all along the chain from wells to final consumer, but also due to purposeful emissions as the gas is processed, stored, and transported. Because of these methane emissions, the use of shale gas in the U.S. has an even greater negative impact on the climate than does coal when we consider methane on the timescale of 20 years after it's emitted. LNG imported to Ireland from the United States would have an even greater greenhouse gas footprint. To liquefy and transport the gas requires a substantial amount of energy, And so to import 1 cubic meter of gas as LNG requires the production of 1.2 cubic meters of gas, with 0.2 cubic meters of that gas burned to provide the energy for the liquefaction, et cetera. With that, we increase the carbon dioxide emissions as well as methane emissions, and I therefore estimate that the use of shale gas imported as LNG to Ireland would create a greenhouse gas emission of 156 grams of carbon dioxide equivalents per megajoule, or a footprint that's 40% greater than that of coal. I've provided a figure which demonstrates that. This is a minimum estimate that does not include additional methane emissions associated with storing and transporting the LNG. There are few, if any, data available on those methane emissions during transport, but they could be substantial. From the standpoint of climate change, LNG is a very poor fuel choice, worse even than using shale gas in the United States. I urge Ireland to prohibit the importation of fracked shale gas from the United States.
In terms of our emissions, we do not examine emissions from outside of our territorial emissions. According to the UN FCC conventions, the emissions that Ireland are responsible are the emissions that occur within our own territory. So within our science, we don't actually assess the emissions that come from outside of Ireland.
And that is, could they please try and describe to us what it would mean in terms of climate mitigation if we were to reduce the methane emissions, just as they've gone up, if we were to bring them right back down. In other words, if we refuse to take gas, if all countries were refused to take gas from the US, how much fracked gas from the US, how much good we could do in terms of climate emission and how quickly we could do it.
Thank you.
In relation to the impact of methane and potentially reducing methane emissions very rapidly, the big win there is that it actually does buy us more time. Because methane is faster acting, then if we could effectively constrain, reduce methane emissions in the short term, that would actually buy us somewhat more time to do this complete reconstruction of our energy system, and we desperately do need that additional time.
I agree with my colleague. If we reduce methane emissions now, we slow the rate of global warming now. And unlike carbon dioxide, where there's a lag of several decades due to uptake and release by the oceans, if we are serious about trying to minimize the risk of major thresholds in the climate system and irreversible runaway global warming, we really do need to try and keep the planet well below 2 degrees Celsius. We don't have to 2050 to do that. We need to start moving that way now, and it absolutely requires reducing methane emissions. So I don't buy this idea of natural gas as a bridge or transitional fuel at all.
I am, of course, aware of the concerns that some sources of natural gas, such as fracked gas, can have higher levels of fugitive gases, which generate additional greenhouse gases in the form of methane than other sources of natural gas. This is based on certain research papers that have been published, I think, by Cornell University. And while there is debate about that research, I am conscious that in the context of the use of projects of common interest, that we should be conscious of those. And in that regard, I've instructed my officials to ask the European Commission whether the implications of importing LNG, both conventionally and unconventionally extracted into the European Union, has been examined in terms of a sustainable, secure and competitive European energy policy, and if not, that should be undertaken. I can also give an assurance to the House in that being on the list of projects of common interest confers two benefits. One is the potential quicker planning process, but as you know, this Shannon LNG project is already in its planning process, and that benefit is it does not confer anything fresh on this particular project. The second potential benefit that this would confer is that this project could apply for funding under the Common European Funding Mechanism. As I indicated again in the comments that I made, we will not support, that will come back to the government for consideration if such an application is made, and I will be considering such against the backdrop of a review of energy security and sustainability, which I'm undertaking. And it's only if I'm satisfied in the context of that review of energy security and sustainability would I consider supporting funding for this private sector project.
There was the question of the Shannon. Thank you for that. Indeed, that is it's a good example where our problems lay today. Also for the Commission, because you have to understand that the PCI process in the first place is in the hand, as I said, it's bottom-up, of member states, of what they want to have, and then it goes to regional groups, etc. So we are, as a Commission, when it comes to us, we have to follow some clear rules. We cannot keep a project on the list if one member state opposes it. And we have had these cases this time. On the other hand, if there is no opposition and we are doing a cost-benefit analysis and it shows a positive social welfare ratio, then we are, at this moment in time, obliged to take it. We have, and that is also what Mr. Peterson has raised, and I take that here is a missing link in our system that we should have for future projects, a real scrutiny, a real assessment on the climate policy compatibility of these projects. And that, in my view, I gave you a concrete example, means no, let's say, one or single natural gas pipeline anymore. It has to be multi-purpose. To discuss what you have claimed, rightly so, where is the sustainability or climate impact assessment? Unfortunately, we are not doing it. This is certainly a missing link that is in our current catalogue of criteria, which need to be added. And the Commission knows the danger is there. If you are putting today such a pipeline into the water, it stays there for the next 50 years. And that is certainly something where we also have, if you look into the future, the problems.
But I just wanted to concentrate on the pressing issue of Shannon LNG project and the government's persistence in defending its retention on the PCI list, despite Ireland's unequivocal opposition to using fracked gas in our energy mix. The Climate Advisory Council has not given consideration to non-territorial emissions, even though it is in their remit to do so. And as you quoted Professor John Fitzgerald earlier, he also said in committee he described gas emissions as a distraction. Deputy Naughton on TV3 described discussions on fracked gas as a sideshow. I put it to you, Minister, that there are grave concerns that the Government seeks to row back on Ireland's anti-fracking commitments. As you're proposing to commission a report on the security and sustainability of Ireland's energy supplies, it is imperative that you understand that this report will be meaningless if it does not include the assessment of non-territorial emissions. As Professor Barry Mullen put it in his evidence to the Climate Action Committee on October the 9th, we currently delegate responsibility for those emissions to the US. However, and as is the US's frequent tantrums and continuous threats to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, all bets are off, and we will have to look at our own responsibility much more closely. Minister, we have a co-responsibility in our climate change obligations to do no harm to others and to do no further harm to our planet in pursuit of our own mitigation. There is no circumstances under which frack gas can be a component of Ireland's future energy mix, none whatsoever. Minister, I will finish by calling on you to ask to prevail upon the Taoiseach to stop trolling the citizens of this country and start taking the climate obligations seriously. He has done a grave disservice to the science and the glaring evidence of climate chaos, while giving comfort to those unable to see the wood from the trees. Thank you very much.
Margaret,
Minister, I'm going to focus also now on LNG and the LNG terminal proposed. this is something which is fundamentally at odds with not only our climate action plan, but also with the decision in Ireland to ban fracking, and also with indeed the decision to divest from fossil fuels. Because we need to be clear, fracked gas is a fossil fuel. And we are looking in the LNG terminal, and we had very strong testimony from Professor Howarth, cited literally thousands of times, as to the impact of methane which emerges during the process of fracking and indeed its transportation. A tonne of methane has 34 times the impact of a tonne of carbon. And what's really crucial is that the methane acts faster. So while we've been told that gas is a transition fuel that is somehow going to give us the space to do what we need to do, the fact is that fracked gas, with the methane associated in its production, is in fact an accelerant. It is not giving us space to act, it is shortening the time we have to act. Because the impacts of methane production, again, 1/3 of which, all of the methane production currently in the atmosphere, coming through the atmosphere, comes from fracking in the United States. That one source, a business which we would be supporting if we went ahead with the LNG terminal, that leads to higher temperature, greater absorption by the climate, and again, a shortening of the time to do the kinds of massive cultural shifts that we need to do. And it's very important, it was mentioned, this idea that non-territorial emissions don't emit. We're on one planet. We're facing one crisis. And it's simply not acceptable that upstream costs would be disappeared somehow from a kind of a clean ledger that we manufacture. And that's important on a global level as well. We see, for example, Japan and Europe have signed a trade agreement which has the climate targets in it, but meanwhile Japan is funding coal-fired plants in Bangladesh. We cannot simply move the problem offshore and hope that it will somehow not blow back to hit us. And certainly in a week when the US is making definitive, clear moves that they plan to pull out of the climate accord, we cannot have anything that rewards climate vandalism or irresponsible action in terms of fracking in a country. I mean, the Minister, everybody, Ireland, indeed the Taoiseach, were very eloquent about Mercosur and their concerns about not taking actions that would encourage violation of our climate targets in that regard. We need to be consistent. So, Minister, I urge you to mull back in terms of the PCI. And I would also note there's been a little bit of a sense of, well, we're waiting and seeing, and it's a private industry that's happening. It's not. Let's be clear. By putting it on the Projects of Common Interest list, the language here says projects of common interest shall become an integral part of the relevant regional investment plans under Article 12 and the relevant national 10-year network development plans under Article 22. So we are saying that we want to make this a priority if we go ahead with it. We are placing it at the centre of our national plan. It's certainly not a private enterprise that is happening separately. Minister, I urge you to take any action you can in relation to this.
I suppose the issue that has generated the most heat is around LNG. And I suppose just to explain the position, liquid natural gas, LNG, liquefied natural gas, it can be fracked or it can be not fracked, but equally, the supply that comes in from Scotland can be fracked or not fracked. So fracked gas can go into any delivery. I think the reason why CNG, the LNG project in Shannon has created such controversy is that it is an American-sponsored one, and it does raise the issue of fracked gas. Now, the evidence that has been cited is one that I think we do need to look at, and I'm very conscious of that, and that's why I did make the announcement that I'm going to have a security and sustainability investigation, and I will not support any funding for this project until I'm satisfied on that. That has, and that paper that has been presented, it does present evidence that is disputed, let's be said, not everyone agrees with it. He advocates putting a loading on methane of 86 to 1. The present, our EPA uses 25 to 1. So he's arguing that methane should be treated in a completely different way than is now the consensus approach. He also produces grounds, and again it's arguable, saying that the methane emissions from fracking and from shale oil and gas is far higher than from natural gas, and I think that evidence has to be examined, of course, to see, and I raised this with Europe, and it too. But I think, to be fair to Senator O'Sullivan, the reason why these projects have been on the projects of common interest is that gas remains a transition fuel. As we move, and our ambition is to have 5 times as much renewables. So instead of 30% renewables, it'll be 70%. When the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, we need something to power our system. At the moment, that is gas. There is no other option available to us. In time, we may see hydrogen. We may see, carbon capture and storage. We may see different technologies emerge that allow that. Bigger batteries, more Thurlock Hill type projects, though they're very expensive at the scale we'd need to do it on. So none of these are available to us at the moment. Gas is the transition fuel. We depend, and Europe depends largely on imported gas, a lot of it coming from Russia. So they do see a security of supply issue in having alternatives, and LNG terminals are such an alternative. And that's why it has been on the projects of common interest in Europe for 6 years. But the key and the only advantage being on that common interest is that it could be eligible for state aid, and we have made very clear that we will not support it for such aid until we're satisfied about the robustness of what is being proposed, and examining fracked gas, but also examining this whole gas transition, the role of gas in transition. Some people, particularly in the lower house, have been advocating no more exploration for any fuel. When that was tested by the science at the Climate Advisory Council, oil was out, but we should continue to prospect for gas because we need it in this transition. And I think we do have to make decisions on the evidence, not just on instinctive, that we don't want any more fossil fuel technology. We are in a transition. It won't happen overnight, and it is a challenging one.